The blood on her apron had long since dried to rust by the time Violet Dawson heard the creak of wagon wheels approaching the makeshift hospital in Walla Walla, Washington. And she knew without looking that more broken men were coming to test the limits of her endurance. The year was 1877, and the conflicts between settlers and native tribes along the eastern Washington territories had left a trail of wounded soldiers stumbling through the small frontier town that had sprung up around the old mission. She wiped her hands on a relatively clean section of cloth and stepped out into the dusty street, where the late afternoon sun cast long shadows between the scattered buildings that made up what the locals hopefully called civilization. The wagon driver, a grizzled army sergeant with a face like weathered leather, nodded curtly as he pulled the horses to a halt. 3 men lay in the back, 2 unconscious and 1 gritting his teeth against obvious pain. Violet moved quickly, her practiced eye assessing their conditions even as she called for help from the handful of volunteers who had been keeping watch. The unconscious men were carried inside first, laid carefully on the cots that lined the walls of what had once been a general store before she and Dr. Harmon had converted it into their medical station 6 months earlier. The third man, the conscious one, tried to wave her off as she approached. "Madam, there are others worse than me," he said through clenched teeth, his hand pressed against his side where blood seeped between his fingers. "Let me be the judge of that," Violet replied, her voice firm but gentle as she helped him down from the wagon. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 25 at most, with dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat and eyes that held the particular exhaustion that came from too many days without proper rest. She guided him inside and settled him on the last available cot, then began the familiar routine of cutting away his shirt to examine the wound. The gash along his ribs was deep, but clean, the kind that would heal if infection did not set in. She worked quickly, cleaning and stitching with steady hands while he watched her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Most men either looked away or passed out, but this one studied her as though trying to memorize every feature. "You have done this before," he said finally, and it was not quite a question. "More times than I care to count," Violet answered, tying off the last stitch and reaching for clean bandages. "You are lucky. Another inch and this would have been considerably more serious." "Luck." He laughed, then winced at the pain the movement caused. "I suppose that is one word for it." She finished wrapping his ribs and stepped back, already turning her attention to the next patient. The evening stretched ahead with hours of work still remaining, wounds to clean, fevers to monitor, and the constant vigil against the infections that killed more men than the initial injuries ever did. Dr. Harmon was in the back room, performing surgery on one of the unconscious soldiers, and she could hear his low voice giving instructions to his assistant. The days blurred together in a haze of blood and bandages, and the particular smell that hospitals carried, a mixture of carbolic acid and suffering that clung to everything despite her best efforts at cleanliness. Violet had come to Walla Walla 2 years earlier with her father, a minister who had believed he could bring his particular brand of salvation to the frontier. He had died within 6 months, his constitution no match for the harsh winter and the pneumonia that had swept through the valley. She had stayed, partly because she had nowhere else to go and partly because the town needed her skills as a nurse more than she needed the comfort of returning east to her mother's family in Pennsylvania. She was 23 years old and had already seen enough death to last several lifetimes. Her hands shook sometimes when she was alone at night in the small room she rented above the general store, but during the day she kept them steady through sheer force of will. The soldiers needed her to be strong, and so she was, even when the weight of their suffering threatened to crush her beneath its burden. 3 days after the wagon had arrived, she was changing the bandages on the young soldier with the rib wound when he spoke her name. She had introduced herself at some point during those first frantic hours, but she had not realized he had been paying attention. "Miss Dawson," he said, "I have been watching you." She paused, her hand still on the fresh bandages. "That sounds rather ominous, soldier." "Zachary," he said. "Zachary Finch, and I did not mean it to sound ominous. I meant that I have been watching how you work, how you move from one patient to the next like you are performing some kind of sacred ritual. You never falter, never show fear or disgust, even when the wounds are terrible." Violet resumed her work, tucking the bandages neatly into place. "Fear and disgust do not heal wounds, Mr. Finch. Only competence and care can do that. You have both in abundance," he said quietly, "but I wonder what it costs you." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw that his eyes held something beyond the usual gratitude of patients toward their caregivers. There was recognition there, as though he understood the particular loneliness that came from being the one who tended the broken while remaining unbroken oneself. "The cost is irrelevant," she said finally, gathering her supplies. "The work must be done regardless." But his words stayed with her through the rest of that day and into the next. She found herself aware of his presence in the room in a way that was different from her awareness of the other patients. When she moved past his cot, she could feel his gaze following her, not with any impropriety but with a steady attention that made her conscious of every movement. It was unsettling and oddly comforting at the same time. Zachary Finch recovered quickly, his youth and overall health serving him well. Within a week, he was able to sit up without assistance, and within 2, he was walking around the hospital, helping with small tasks despite her protests that he should be resting. He had a way with the other soldiers, she noticed, an easy manner that seemed to lift their spirits even when they were in considerable pain. He would sit by their cots and talk to them in a low voice, telling stories of life on the cattle ranches where he had worked before joining the army, painting pictures with his words of wide open spaces and the satisfaction of honest labor under the vast western sky. "You are not a career soldier," Violet observed one evening as they stood together on the porch of the hospital, watching the sun set over the blue mountains in the distance. The air was finally beginning to cool after another sweltering August day, and she had stepped outside to catch her breath between patients. "No, madam," Zachary agreed. He had taken to joining her during these brief respites, appearing at her elbow with a quiet greeting and then simply standing there, sharing the silence. "I signed up when tension started escalating earlier this year. Figured it was better to volunteer than to wait and be conscripted. But my heart belongs to the range, not the battlefield." "What made you choose the life of a cowboy?" she asked, genuinely curious. Most of the men she knew had drifted into their occupations by chance or necessity rather than choice. He was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "Freedom, I suppose. The work is hard and the pay is poor, but there is something about being out there with nothing but the cattle and the stars that makes a man feel truly alive. No one telling you who to be or what to believe, just you and the land and the job that needs doing." Violet felt a pang of something that might have been envy. She could barely remember a time when she had felt that kind of freedom, that sense of possibility. Her life had been circumscribed by duty and obligation for as long as she could recall, first to her father and his mission, now to the endless stream of wounded men who needed her skills. "That sounds wonderful," she said softly. Zachary turned to look at her, and in the fading light his face held an expression she could not quite read. "You should see it sometime. The open range, I mean. It would do you good to get away from all this death and suffering, even if just for a little while." "I cannot leave," she said automatically. "Dr. Harmon needs my help and the soldiers keep coming." "The soldiers will always keep coming," Zachary said gently. "There will always be another war, another conflict, another wagon full of broken men. If you wait until there is no more need, you will wait forever." His words struck her with the force of revelation, though she pushed the feeling away as quickly as it had come. She could not afford to think about her own needs when others were depending on her. That was a luxury she had given up long ago, so long that she barely remembered what it felt like to put herself first. The conversation stayed with her, though, working its way into her thoughts during the quiet moments between tasks. She found herself watching Zachary with the same intensity he had once watched her, noting the careful way he moved despite the injury that was still healing, the patience he showed with the other soldiers, the quick flash of his smile when someone made a joke. He was not classically handsome, his features too rough-hewn for that, but there was something compelling about him nonetheless, a quality of steadiness that drew people to him like moths to a flame. A week later, Dr. Harmon announced that Zachary was well enough to be discharged. The news should have brought relief, one more patient successfully treated and returned to the world. But instead, Violet felt a strange hollowness in her chest. She had grown accustomed to his presence, she realized, to the quiet conversations, and the way he seemed to understand the burdens she carried without her having to explain them. On his last evening in the hospital, Zachary found her in the supply room, taking inventory of their dwindling stock of bandages and medicines. The next shipment was not due for another 2 weeks, and she was trying to calculate how to make their current supplies stretch to cover the need. "Miss Dawson," he said from the doorway, his hat in his hands, "I wanted to thank you before I leave tomorrow. You saved my life." "You are welcome, Mr. Finch," she said, keeping her eyes on her ledger. "I am glad to see you recovered." "Violet," he said, using her given name for the first time, and the sound of it on his lips made her look up. "I need to tell you something before I go, and I hope you will not think me too forward for saying it." She set down her pen, giving him her full attention. There was something in his voice that made her heart beat faster, though she could not have said why. "Your compassion heals more than just bodies," Zachary said, the words coming out in a rush as though he had been rehearsing them. "These past weeks, watching you work, seeing the way you care for every soldier who comes through those doors no matter how hopeless their condition might seem, it has changed something in me. You have changed something in me. The way you give everything you have to helping others, never asking for anything in return, never complaining about the burden it places on you. That kind of goodness is rare, Violet, rarer than gold or any treasure a man might find." She stood frozen, unable to formulate a response. No one had ever spoken to her like this before, with such raw honesty and emotion. Men had expressed gratitude, certainly, but this was something different, something deeper that made her feel exposed and vulnerable in a way that was both frightening and exhilarating. "I do not know what to say," she managed finally. "You do not have to say anything," Zachary replied. "I just needed you to know that you matter, that the work you do matters, not just in the practical sense of keeping men alive, but in the way you make them feel seen and valued even in their worst moments. You certainly made me feel that way." He turned to go then, but Violet heard herself speak before she could think better of it. "Will you stay in Walla Walla? After your discharge, I mean." Zachary looked back at her, hope kindling in his eyes. "I had not planned to. I was going to head south to the ranches in Oregon where I used to work, but if there was a reason to stay, I would consider it." The implication hung in the air between them, a question without words. Violet knew she should let him go, should maintain the professional distance that had served her so well for the past 2 years. Getting attached to someone, allowing herself to care about more than just his medical recovery, was a complication she did not need. And yet the thought of him leaving, of never seeing him again, created an ache in her chest that surprised her with its intensity. "The town always needs capable men," she said carefully. "There are several ranches in the area that hire hands. The pay is decent and the work is honest." A slow smile spread across Zachary's face, transforming his features. "Then I suppose I will be staying after all, at least for a while, to see how things develop." He left the supply room then, and Violet returned to her inventory with hands that trembled slightly as she picked up her pen. She told herself it was simply fatigue, that she was overtired from too many long days and too little rest. But she knew, in the deepest part of herself, that something had shifted between them. Some boundary had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. Zachary was discharged the following morning, but he did not leave Walla Walla. True to his word, he found work at a ranch 10 miles outside of town, a sprawling operation that ran cattle across thousands of acres of rangeland. He came into town every Saturday, ostensibly to purchase supplies, but Violet noticed that his visits always included a stop at the hospital. He would bring fresh eggs from the ranch or vegetables from the foreman's wife's garden, small offerings that he presented with an almost shy courtesy, before asking if there was anything else she needed. At first their conversations were brief and superficial, constrained by the presence of others and the demands on her time. But gradually, as the weeks turned into months, they found ways to steal longer moments together. He would time his visits to coincide with her brief afternoon breaks, and they would walk together through the town, talking about everything and nothing. She learned that he had grown up in Wyoming, the youngest of 5 children on a failing homestead, and that he had left at 16 to make his own way in the world. He told her about the years he had spent learning the cattle trade, the hard lessons and harder men who had taught him his profession, and the deep satisfaction he found in a job well done. In turn, she told him about her childhood in Pennsylvania, about her father's fervent belief in his calling and her mother's quiet resignation to a life lived in service to that belief. She spoke of the books she had loved as a girl, the dreams she had harbored of becoming a teacher or perhaps a writer, and how those dreams had been set aside when circumstances demanded she become a nurse instead. "It is not too late," Zachary said one October afternoon as they sat together on a bench outside the general store, watching the town go about its business. "You could still pursue those dreams if you wanted to." Violet shook her head. Those were childish fantasies. "The world needs nurses more than it needs another mediocre writer." "I doubt anything you did would be mediocre," Zachary said firmly. "But even if nursing is your calling, you deserve more than this endless grind of duty and obligation. You deserve joy, Violet. You deserve someone who can give you that." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw the depth of feeling in his eyes. He was not merely expressing a general sentiment but making a very specific offer, one that made her breath catch in her throat. The autumn sun was warm on her face, and for just a moment she allowed herself to imagine a different life, one where she could lean on someone else instead of always being the one others leaned on. "I do not know if I remember how to feel joy," she admitted quietly. "It has been so long." Zachary reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. "Then let me teach you. Let me show you what it is like to be cared for instead of always being the caregiver." She should have pulled away, should have reminded him of all the reasons why this was impossible. She had her work, he had his, and the frontier was no place for the kind of romantic dreams he was suggesting. But she did not pull away. Instead, she let her hand rest in his and felt something inside her chest, something that had been frozen for longer than she could remember, begin to thaw. Their courtship, if it could be called that, was a slow and gentle thing, constrained by her long hours at the hospital and his demanding work at the ranch. But they made it work, carving out small pockets of time to be together, building something solid and real from those stolen moments. He taught her to ride, borrowing horses from the ranch, and taking her out into the hills where the autumn colors blazed against the brilliant blue sky. She was a terrible rider at first, stiff and nervous, but he was patient, guiding her with steady hands and an encouraging voice until she began to relax and feel the rhythm of the horse beneath her. On one of those rides, when the leaves were at their peak and the air held the first crisp promise of winter, Zachary led her to a high meadow that overlooked the valley. They dismounted and stood together at the edge, looking out over the patchwork of ranches and farms spread below them, with the town of Walla Walla visible in the distance as a small cluster of buildings beside the river. "This is what I was talking about," Zachary said, gesturing at the expanse before them. "This feeling of space and possibility. Out here, it seems like anything is possible." Violet breathed in the clean, cold air and felt something expand inside her chest, some tension she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten it was there beginning to release. "I see why you love it," she said softly. "It is beautiful." "Not as beautiful as you," Zachary said, and when she turned to look at him, he was watching her with an expression that made her knees weak. "Violet, I know we have not known each other long, and I know the timing is far from ideal, but I need to tell you something. I am falling in love with you." "Actually, I think I have been falling in love with you since the first moment you took care of my wound. When I saw the way you held yourself together through sheer determination, even though I could see how tired you were. You are the strongest, most compassionate person I have ever met, and I cannot imagine my life without you in it." She stared at him, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. No one had ever spoken to her like this, with such unvarnished honesty and vulnerability. It terrified her and thrilled her in equal measure. "I do not know how to do this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do not know how to be the person someone loves. All I know is duty and work and keeping myself together so others do not fall apart." Zachary stepped closer, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "You do not have to know how. We will figure it out together one day at a time. All I am asking is that you let me try, that you give us a chance to see what we might become together." She wanted to say yes, wanted it with a fierce intensity that surprised her. But the words stuck in her throat, held back by years of learned caution, and the fear of losing herself in someone else's needs the way she had lost herself in her father's mission, and then in the hospital's endless demands. "I am afraid," she admitted finally, the confession torn from somewhere deep inside her. "I am afraid that if I let myself love you, I will lose the parts of myself that I have fought so hard to keep." "Then we will make sure that does not happen," Zachary said firmly. "Love is not supposed to diminish you, Violet. It is supposed to make you more fully yourself, not less. If I ever make you feel like you are losing yourself, I want you to tell me and we will fix it. Together." The simple certainty in his voice, the absolute conviction that they could make this work, finally broke through her defenses. She found herself nodding, tears streaming down her face, though she could not have said if they were from fear or relief, or some complicated mixture of both. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I want to try. I want to see what we might become together." Zachary pulled her into his arms then, and she let herself lean against him, let herself be held for the first time in longer than she could remember. His heart beat steady beneath her ear, and his arms around her felt like the safest place in the world. They stood like that for a long time, two people finding shelter in each other while the wind whispered through the grass, and the autumn sun painted the valley below in shades of gold and amber. The winter came early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a fury that caught everyone by surprise. The first real snow fell in late November, and with it came a new wave of wounded soldiers, victims of a skirmish near the Snake River that had gone badly for both sides. The hospital was overwhelmed within hours, every cot filled and men lying on makeshift pallets on the floor. Violet worked around the clock, snatching a few hours of sleep when she could no longer keep her eyes open, then forcing herself awake to continue the endless rounds of wound care and medicine administration. Zachary appeared on the second day of the crisis, having ridden through the snow from the ranch. He did not ask permission or wait for instructions, simply rolled up his sleeves and began helping however he could. He was good with the men, his calm presence and steady hands useful for everything from holding down patients during painful procedures to sitting with the dying, so they would not be alone at the end. Dr. Harmon, who normally bristled at untrained assistants, took one look at the situation and nodded his approval. "You have done this before," he observed to Zachary during a brief break. "Some," Zachary acknowledged. "We had a bad outbreak of cholera at a cattle camp 3 years back. Lost a lot of good men, but I learned how to help those who could be helped and comfort those who could not." "Then you are welcome here," the doctor said. "God knows we need every capable pair of hands we can get." For 3 weeks, Violet and Zachary worked side by side in the cramped, increasingly stuffy space of the hospital. They developed a rhythm, an unspoken understanding of what needed to be done and who was best positioned to do it. She found herself relying on him in ways she had never relied on anyone before, trusting him to handle critical tasks without supervision, and knowing he would do them well. When she was on the verge of collapse from exhaustion, he would gently but firmly insist she rest, taking over her duties while she caught a few precious hours of sleep. And in the darkest moments, when patients died despite everything they could do, he was there to share the grief. He did not try to minimize the loss or offer empty platitudes, just sat with her in quiet acknowledgement that sometimes their best efforts were not enough. That simple understanding, that willingness to bear witness to her pain without trying to fix it, meant more to her than any words could have expressed. By mid-December, the crisis had passed. The surviving soldiers were either well enough to return to duty or stable enough to be transported to larger military hospitals elsewhere. The makeshift ward grew quiet, the rows of cots gradually emptying until only a handful of patients remained. Violet stood in the center of the room one evening, looking at the empty spaces where men had suffered and fought and sometimes won their battles against death, and felt the full weight of the past week settle onto her shoulders. Zachary found her there, standing alone in the lamplight with her arms wrapped around herself as though trying to hold something together that was threatening to fly apart. He did not say anything, just came and stood beside her, his presence a solid anchor in the swirling chaos of her emotions. "So many died," she said finally, her voice hollow. "We worked so hard and still so many died. And many lived who would not have without you," Zachary said quietly. "You cannot measure your worth by the ones you could not save, Violet. You have to count the ones who walked out of here because of your skill and dedication." "How do you do it?" she asked, turning to look at him. "How do you accept the losses and keep going?" Zachary was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "I remind myself that I am not God. I cannot control whether someone lives or dies, can only do my best to help and then let go of the outcome. It is not easy, and it hurts every time we lose someone, but the alternative is to stop trying altogether, and that seems worse somehow. His words echoed something her father used to say. Though coming from Zachary, they felt less like a religious platitude and more like practical wisdom earned through hard experience. She let herself lean against him, too tired to maintain the walls she usually kept between herself and the world, and felt his arm come around her shoulders. "I am so tired," she confessed. "I am tired of being strong, tired of holding everything together, tired of watching people suffer." "I know," Zachary said, his voice infinitely gentle, "but you do not have to carry it all alone anymore. I am here, Violet, and I am not going anywhere. Let me help carry the burden." Something inside her cracked open at those words, some final barrier she had been maintaining against the vulnerability of truly needing someone. She turned in his arms and buried her face against his chest, and for the second time since meeting him, she allowed herself to cry. He held her while she sobbed, his hands stroking her back in a soothing rhythm, and did not try to stop her or tell her everything would be fine. He just let her feel what she was feeling, gave her permission to be broken for a little while, and somehow that made all the difference. When the storm of emotion finally passed, leaving her wrung out but strangely lighter, she pulled back and looked up at him. His face was full of such tenderness and concern that it made her chest ache. "Thank you," she said simply, "for being here, for understanding, for everything." "Always," Zachary replied, and sealed the promise with a kiss that was gentle and sweet and full of all the things he could not put into words. Christmas came, a quiet affair in the snow-locked town. Violet had never paid much attention to the holiday, too busy with work to bother with decorations or celebrations. But Zachary was determined that this year would be different. He showed up at her room on Christmas Eve with a small pine tree that he had cut himself, already decorated with strings of popcorn and red berries that glowed in the lamplight. "You need this," he said, setting it in the corner with careful ceremony. "Everyone needs a little beauty in their life, especially at this time of year." She wanted to protest that it was unnecessary, that she had too much to do to fuss with such frivolities, but the words died on her lips when she saw the expression on his face. He was not doing this for himself but for her, trying to give her a piece of the joy and wonder she had lost somewhere along the way. "It is lovely," she said instead, and meant it. "Thank you." They spent the evening together in her small room, talking and laughing over a simple meal of bread and cheese and the precious pot of honey he had brought from the ranch. The tree glowed softly in the corner, filling the space with the scent of pine, and for a few hours Violet allowed herself to simply be happy, to exist in the moment without worrying about the next crisis or the next wounded soldier who would need her help. When it grew late and Zachary prepared to leave, making his way back to the ranch through the snow, he paused at the door and pulled a small package from his pocket. "I have something for you," he said, almost shyly. "It is not much, but I wanted you to have it." Violet unwrapped the paper to find a delicate silver locket on a chain. Inside was a tiny photograph, though she could not imagine where he had found it or how he had afforded such a luxury on a ranch hand's wages. The photograph showed the two of them together, taken on one of their rides into the hills, and seeing their faces side by side made her throat tight with emotion. "How did you manage this?" she asked, her fingers tracing the smooth metal. "I have my ways," Zachary said with a small smile. "I wanted you to have something to remind you that you are not alone, even when I cannot be with you. Something to remind you that someone loves you more than life itself." She could not speak past the lump in her throat, so instead she stood on her toes and kissed him, pouring everything she felt into that connection. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, his eyes were dark with emotion. "Marry me," he said suddenly, the words tumbling out as though he had not planned to say them. "I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other a few months, but I am certain of this, Violet. I am certain of you and me and what we could build together. Marry me, and let me spend the rest of my life making you as happy as you make me." She stared at him, her heart racing. Everything logical and sensible in her brain was screaming that this was too fast, too sudden, that she barely knew him and he barely knew her. But her heart, that part of her she had kept locked away for so long, was singing a different tune entirely. It was saying yes, yes, 1,000 times yes, because this man saw her in a way no one else ever had and loved her anyway. Loved her not despite her flaws and fears, but because of the whole complicated person she was. "Yes," she heard herself say, the word coming out strong and clear and absolutely certain. "Yes, I will marry you." The joy that blazed across his face was brighter than any Christmas tree, and when he swept her into his arms and spun her around, laughing with pure delight, she found herself laughing too, the sound rusty from disuse but genuine. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time in her entire life, Violet allowed herself to believe that happiness was not just something other people experienced, but something she could have too. They were married in February, in a simple ceremony at the small church that served Walla Walla and the surrounding ranches. Dr. Harmon gave her away, his normally stern face creased with a genuine smile, and the church was packed with soldiers she had treated over the months, cowboys from the various ranches, and townspeople who had come to know and respect the quiet nurse who worked such long hours at the hospital. Violet wore a dress she had sewn herself from pale blue fabric, the nicest thing she had owned in years, and Zachary wore his best shirt and a new vest he had saved for weeks to purchase. When they spoke their vows, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever trials the future might bring, Violet felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. This was what she had been missing, this sense of partnership and shared purpose. Zachary was not trying to save her or fix her or change her into something different. He simply loved her as she was and wanted to build a life with her, and that simple acceptance was the most precious gift anyone had ever given her. They moved into a small house on the edge of town, a modest structure that had been empty since its previous owner had moved back east. It needed work. The roof leaked and the floorboards creaked and the stove was temperamental at best, but it was theirs, a place they could shape together into a home. Zachary continued working at the ranch while Violet maintained her position at the hospital, though Dr. Harmon agreed to hire another nurse so she would not have to work such punishing hours. The rhythm of married life suited them both. They would meet in the evenings after work, sharing meals and stories of their days, and slowly the house began to transform. Zachary repaired the roof and fixed the floors, built shelves for Violet's small collection of books and a garden bed for the vegetables they would plant in spring. Violet sewed curtains for the windows and made the house feel warm and welcoming, adding small touches of beauty that made the space feel like more than just a shelter against the elements. But it was in the quiet moments, the times when they were alone together with no demands on their attention, that Violet felt most completely herself. Zachary had a way of drawing her out of the carefully controlled persona she showed the world, making her laugh with his stories and challenging her to think about things in new ways. He listened when she talked about her work at the hospital, offering insights that helped her process the difficult emotions that came with caring for the suffering, and he held her when the nightmares came, the dreams of all the patients she had been unable to save. In turn, she learned the depths of him, the man behind the quiet competence he showed the world. He had been hurt before, she discovered, though he did not speak of it often. A woman back in Wyoming, someone he had thought he would marry, who had left him for a man with better prospects and more money. The betrayal had marked him, made him cautious about opening his heart, but he had chosen to trust her anyway, and she honored that trust by giving him the same honesty and vulnerability in return. Spring came late to the Walla Walla Valley, the last snows finally melting in late March to reveal the rich, dark soil beneath. Zachary planted the garden while Violet worked at the hospital, and she would come home in the evenings to find him covered in dirt, but grinning with satisfaction at the neat rows of seedlings beginning to push through the earth. They were building something together, she realized, not just a household but a life, with deep roots that would sustain them through whatever storms might come. In early May, Violet realized her monthly courses had not come. She told herself it meant nothing, that her body had always been somewhat irregular, but deep down she knew what it meant even before Dr. Harmon confirmed her suspicions. She was carrying Zachary's child, a life growing inside her that was half him and half her, a physical manifestation of the love they shared. She was terrified. The frontier was a dangerous place for women in childbirth, and she had seen too many die from complications that could not be treated with their limited medical resources. But she was also filled with a strange, fierce joy, a sense that this was right and good and exactly what was supposed to happen. When she told Zachary that evening, standing in their small kitchen with the late afternoon sun streaming through the window, his face went through a dozen emotions in quick succession, before settling on pure, incandescent happiness. "A baby," he breathed, his hand reaching out to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby. Are you pleased?" she asked, suddenly uncertain. They had never discussed children, had been too focused on learning to be married to think about what might come next. "Pleased." Zachary laughed, the sound rich with emotion. "Violet, I am beyond pleased. I am terrified and thrilled and already so in love with this child I can barely stand it. You are going to be the most amazing mother." His confidence bolstered her own wavering certainty, and she let herself lean into his embrace, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other and in the wonder of the new life they had created, while the sun sank lower and painted the kitchen in shades of gold. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Violet found the waiting difficult. She was accustomed to being active and busy, and as her body grew heavier and more unwieldy, she chafed at the limitations it imposed. Zachary was endlessly patient with her frustration, taking over more of the household tasks and insisting she rest even when she protested. She felt fine. Dr. Harmon reduced her hours at the hospital, bringing in the new nurse to handle more of the demanding cases. And though Violet missed the work, she had to admit the rest was probably necessary. In the evenings, Zachary would read to her from the books she loved, adventure stories and romances that took them far from the frontier and into worlds of imagination. His voice was soothing, the words washing over her like a balm, and she would rest her hand on her swelling belly and feel the baby move beneath her palm, strong kicks that promised health and vitality. They talked about names, debating the merits of various options. Zachary wanted to name a son after his father, but Violet gently pointed out that his father had abandoned the family when Zachary was 12, leaving them to struggle through on their own, and perhaps that was not the legacy they wanted to invoke. He agreed after a moment's thought, And instead they chose names they both loved, names that felt fresh and full of promise. The baby came in January, during a week when the temperature had dropped so low that ice formed on the inside of the windows. The labor was long and difficult, 36 hours of pain that left Violet weak and trembling. But Dr. Harmon was there throughout, his steady competence giving her something to hold on to when she thought she could not endure another moment. And Zachary was there too, holding her hand and wiping her face with cool cloths, whispering encouragement even when she snapped at him through the pain. When the baby finally arrived, a lusty cry announcing his presence to the world, Violet burst into tears of relief and exhaustion and overwhelming love. Dr. Harmon placed the squirming bundle on her chest, and she looked down into a tiny red face that already showed hints of Zachary's features, and felt her heart expand to dimensions she had not known were possible. "A boy," the doctor announced unnecessarily, smiling at them both. "A fine, healthy boy." Zachary was crying too, unashamed tears streaming down his face as he gazed at his son with an expression of such wonder that Violet fell in love with him all over again. He reached out a tentative finger and the baby's tiny hand wrapped around it, gripping with surprising strength, and Zachary made a sound that was half laugh and half sob. "Hello, Samuel," Violet whispered, using the name they had chosen. "Welcome to the world." The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feeding, and learning how to care for this tiny person who depended on them for everything. Violet had tended children before, had nursed sick infants back to health, but this was entirely different. This was her child, her responsibility, and the weight of it was almost crushing in its intensity. There were moments when she wondered if she was up to the task, if she had made a terrible mistake thinking she could be both a mother and still maintain any sense of herself. But Zachary was there, steady and supportive, taking on more than his share of the burden and never complaining about the interrupted sleep or the constant demands on their time and energy. He would walk Samuel through the house at 3 in the morning, pacing and bouncing and singing off key lullabies until the baby settled, then carefully lay him back in the cradle they had set up beside their bed. And he would look at Violet with such love and gratitude, as though she had given him the most precious gift in the world, which in a way she had. Slowly, they found their rhythm as parents. Violet reduced her hours at the hospital even further, working only 2 days a week, so she could be home with Samuel the rest of the time. It was an adjustment, learning to find satisfaction in the small moments of motherhood, rather than the dramatic saves and critical interventions that had defined her work as a nurse. But as Samuel grew and began to smile, began to recognize her face and reach for her when she entered the room, Violet discovered a new kind of fulfillment, one that was quieter but no less profound. Zachary threw himself into fatherhood with the same intensity he brought to everything else. He built a larger cradle when Samuel outgrew the first one, then a toddler bed when he outgrew that. He taught Samuel to ride almost before the boy could walk, setting him on a gentle mare and walking beside them through the fields while Samuel squealed with delight. And he told stories, endless stories of cowboys and cattle drives and the wide open spaces that had shaped his own life, planting seeds of wonder in his son's imagination. The years passed in a succession of seasons, each one bringing new joys and new challenges. When Samuel was 3, Violet discovered she was pregnant again, and this time the terror was less and the joy more immediate. Their daughter, Rebecca, was born in the summer, a tiny thing with a mass of dark hair and her mother's determined chin. She was easier than Samuel had been, or perhaps they were simply more experienced parents, more confident in their ability to handle whatever came. The house grew more crowded but also more full of life and laughter. Samuel adored his baby sister, hovering over her cradle and bringing her his favorite toys to inspect. Zachary expanded the house, adding 2 more rooms so the children could have their own space as they grew. Violet continued working at the hospital, though her focus had shifted somewhat. She trained the younger nurses who came to work with Dr. Harmon, passing on the skills and knowledge she had accumulated over the years, and found satisfaction in seeing them develop into competent caregivers in their own right. When Samuel was 7 and Rebecca 4, the conflicts between settlers and native tribes that had defined Violet's early years in Walla Walla finally ended. A treaty was signed, terms negotiated that brought an uneasy but real peace to the region. The flow of wounded soldiers through the hospital slowed to a trickle and then stopped entirely, and Dr. Harmon announced he was retiring, selling the practice to a younger doctor who had recently arrived from Portland. It felt like the end of an era, a closing of a chapter that had defined so much of Violet's adult life. She attended the farewell party the town threw for Dr. Harmon, now a man in his 70s who had devoted his life to caring for others, and felt a bittersweet mixture of grief and gratitude. He had been her mentor and her friend, had believed in her abilities when she barely believed in herself, and she would miss him terribly. But as one door closed, others opened. The new doctor, a serious young man named Peterson, asked Violet to stay on as head nurse, recognizing her experience and the respect she commanded among both the medical community and the townspeople. She agreed, pleased to have her skills valued and excited about the possibilities of working with someone who had trained in the latest medical techniques. Zachary had been promoted to foreman at the ranch, a position of responsibility that came with better pay and more regular hours. He used the extra money to expand their property, purchasing the lot next to their house and building a barn where they could keep a few horses and perhaps some chickens. The children loved having animals to care for, taking on small chores with enthusiasm, and Samuel in particular showed signs of following his father into ranch work, always happiest when he was outdoors with the horses. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Zachary took Violet back to the high meadow where he had first told her he was falling in love with her. The valley spread below them, more developed now with new ranches and farms pushing the boundaries of settlement further into what had once been wilderness, but still beautiful in the late summer sun. They stood together at the edge, older now and marked by the years, but still fundamentally the same people who had found each other in a makeshift hospital during a time of conflict and suffering. "You ever regret it?" Zachary asked, his arm around her waist. "Giving up the nursing career you might have had elsewhere for this life with me?" Violet looked at him, surprised by the question. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. You and the children, this life we have built together, it is more than I ever dreamed possible. I would not trade it for anything. Even though it has been hard," he pressed. "Even though you have had to sacrifice things you loved." "Every life requires sacrifices," Violet said slowly, thinking about the question. "The key is making sure you are sacrificing for something that matters more than what you are giving up. I gave up the possibility of being some famous nurse in a big city hospital, but I gained a family, a home, a partnership with someone who sees me for who I really am. That is not a sacrifice, Zachary. That is a gift." He pulled her close, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the light change across the valley. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermal currents, and somewhere in the distance they could hear the lowing of cattle being moved to fresh pasture. "I love you," Zachary said finally. I loved you that first day when you stitched my ribs and looked at me like I was just another job to be completed efficiently. I loved you when I watched you work yourself to exhaustion caring for men you did not know. I loved you when you finally let yourself be vulnerable with me, when you trusted me enough to let me see your fears and doubts. And I love you now, after 10 years and 2 children, and all the ordinary miracles and mundane difficulties of building a life together. You are still the most remarkable person I have ever known. Violet felt tears prick her eyes, though they were happy tears this time, not the ones born of exhaustion and despair that had been so common in those early days. "You make me better," she said softly. "You make me want to be the person you see when you look at me. That is your gift, Zachary. You saw potential in me that I could not see in myself, and you loved me into becoming her." They rode back to town as the sun was setting, arriving home to find Samuel and Rebecca playing in the yard under the watchful eye of their neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who had agreed to watch them for the evening. The children ran to greet them, full of stories about their day, and Violet swept Rebecca up in her arms while Zachary ruffled Samuel's hair affectionately. This was her life now, she thought as they all went inside together, the children chattering and Zachary's hand warm in hers. Not perfect, not always easy, but hers in a way that felt earned and precious. She had found her place in the world, not as a solitary nurse dedicated only to her work, but as a woman with multiple roles and identities, all of them important, all of them contributing to the whole of who she was. The years continued to unfold in their steady progression. Samuel grew into a tall, serious boy who indeed followed his father into ranch work, apprenticing with Zachary and learning the skills that would serve him well in the life he was choosing. Rebecca was more bookish, inheriting her mother's love of learning, and Violet spent hours teaching her to read and write, watching with pride as her daughter devoured every book she could get her hands on. When Violet was 38, she became pregnant for the 3rd time, a surprise that brought equal measures of joy and trepidation. She was older now, and she knew the risks that came with late childbearing, but she was also more experienced, more confident in her own body and its capabilities. The pregnancy was easy, and the birth even easier than her previous 2. And when she held her second son, Thomas, in her arms, she marveled at the unexpected gift of this late addition to their family. Samuel was 15 by then, already a capable ranch hand who worked alongside his father with quiet competence. Rebecca was 12, on the cusp of womanhood and beginning to think about her own future. They both doted on their baby brother, competing to hold him and help care for him, and the house rang with their voices and laughter in a way that made Violet's heart full. Zachary had taken to reading the newspaper aloud in the evenings, sharing stories of the wider world beyond their valley. The country was changing rapidly, railroads stretching across the continent, and bringing with them new opportunities and new challenges. Towns like Walla Walla were growing, becoming more settled and civilized, less frontier and more established community. It was a different world than the one Violet and Zachary had known when they first met, but they had changed with it, adapting and growing just as the land itself was adapting and growing. Dr. Peterson proved to be an excellent physician, and under his leadership the hospital expanded, adding new equipment and new staff to serve the growing population. Violet continued working there, though her role evolved over time. She spent less time doing direct patient care and more time training and supervising, passing on the knowledge she had accumulated through decades of experience. It was satisfying work, seeing the next generation of nurses develop their skills, and she took pride in knowing that her legacy would continue long after she retired. But her true joy was in her family. watching Samuel court and eventually marry a rancher's daughter from a neighboring property, standing beside Rebecca at her graduation from the new high school that had been built in town, holding Thomas as he took his first steps. These were the moments that mattered, the memories she would carry with her always. When Samuel's first child was born, making Violet a grandmother at 43, she felt the strange circularity of time, the way life moved in cycles from generation to generation. She held her granddaughter, Sarah, and saw echoes of her own mother's face, features that had skipped a generation to resurface in this tiny new person. It was humbling and awe-inspiring, this sense of being part of something larger than herself, a chain of life stretching backward into the past and forward into an unknown future. Zachary was a wonderful grandfather, patient and playful in ways he had sometimes struggled to be as a father when the demands of making a living had consumed so much of his time and energy. He would carry Sarah around the property, showing her the horses and the chickens, and telling her stories about when her father was a boy. Violet would watch them together and feel a contentment so deep, it seemed to emanate from her very bones. Rebecca announced her intention to become a teacher, and after graduating from the new teachers' college that had opened in Portland, she returned to Walla Walla to teach at the same high school she had attended. She was brilliant at it, Violet quickly realized, with a gift for making even the most difficult subjects accessible and interesting to her students. Watching her daughter flourish in her chosen profession brought back memories of Violet's own youthful dreams, the ones she had set aside so long ago, and she felt no regret that circumstances had taken her down a different path. After all, if she had pursued those dreams, she would never have met Zachary, never had her children, never built the life that had brought her such deep satisfaction. Thomas grew into a thoughtful, sensitive boy who showed an early interest in medicine. He would follow Violet to the hospital whenever she allowed it, watching the nurses and doctors work with intense concentration, asking endless questions about anatomy and treatment protocols. By the time he was 10, Dr. Peterson had informally taken him under his wing, allowing him to help with simple tasks and explaining the reasoning behind various medical decisions. Violet recognized the passion in her youngest child, the same driving need to help others that had defined her own life, and she encouraged it even as she worried about the toll such a calling could take on a person's soul. On their 20th anniversary, Zachary surprised Violet with a trip to Portland, arranging for the children to stay with Samuel and his wife so they could have a week to themselves. It was the longest they had been away from home since their wedding, and stepping onto the train felt like stepping into a different world. Portland was bustling and modern in ways that Walla Walla would never be, with paved streets and electric lights, and more people than Violet had seen gathered in one place in her entire life. They stayed in a modest hotel near the river and spent their days exploring, visiting museums and theaters and restaurants that served food from around the world. But the most precious time was the quiet hours they spent talking, really talking in ways they had not had time for in years. They spoke of their hopes and dreams for their children, their fears about aging and what the future might hold, their gratitude for the life they had built together against considerable odds. "I think about that night in the hospital sometimes," Zachary said as they sat together watching the sun set over the Willamette River. "When I told you that your compassion heals more than just bodies. I meant it then, but I did not fully understand the depth of what I was saying. You have healed me, Violet, in ways I did not even know I was broken. You taught me what it means to be truly loved, to be accepted completely for who I am rather than who someone thinks I should be. That is a gift beyond measure." Violet reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. They were both graying now, lines etched deep around their eyes and mouths, bodies marked by the years of hard work and the inevitable where that time imposed on everyone. But the connection between them, that spark that had ignited in a makeshift hospital during a long-ago August, burned as bright as ever. "You healed me too," she said quietly. "You taught me that it was okay to need someone, that asking for help was not weakness but wisdom. You showed me that I could be more than just the roles I filled, that I could be a whole person with wants and desires of my own. Without you, I would have worked myself into an early grave, never knowing what I was missing." They sat in comfortable silence as the light faded, and the city lights began to twinkle to life around them. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built something that would endure long after they were gone. The trip back to Walla Walla felt like returning home in the truest sense. The familiar landscape welcomed them, the dry hills and wide sky and the particular quality of light that was unique to this corner of the world. Their children met them at the train station, Thomas launching himself into Violet's arms while Rebecca smiled and Samuel shook his father's hand with solemn dignity. They all walked home together through the familiar streets, and Violet felt the rightness of it settle into her chest, warm and solid. The years continued their inexorable march. Samuel and his wife had 2 more children, giving Violet and Zachary 3 grandchildren to dote on. Rebecca met and married a fellow teacher, a kind man who shared her passion for education, and they began building their own life together in a house not far from Violet and Zachary's. Thomas was accepted to medical school in Seattle, a source of tremendous pride for the entire family, and Violet helped him pack for his journey with a mixture of excitement and melancholy at the thought of him being so far away. Zachary retired from the ranch when he turned 60, his body finally protesting the decades of hard physical labor. He did not take well to idleness at first, restless and irritable at being confined to less demanding activities, but gradually he found new rhythms. He spent more time with his grandchildren, teaching them to ride and rope, and all the skills he had learned over his lifetime. He took up woodworking, building beautiful furniture that he gave to his children and grandchildren. And he read voraciously, working through the stack of books Violet had accumulated over the years and discovering new worlds in their pages. Violet continued working at the hospital until she was 65, finally retiring when Dr. Peterson insisted she had earned her rest. It was harder to leave than she had anticipated, saying goodbye to the work that had defined so much of her adult life. But she had trained her successors well, and she knew the patients would be in capable hands. Her retirement celebration was attended by what seemed like half the town, former patients and colleagues and friends all gathering to honor her decades of service. In her retirement, Violet discovered new passions. She took up writing, the dream from her girlhood finally finding expression in essays and stories about life on the frontier. She volunteered at Rebecca's school, helping struggling students learn to read and watching their faces light up when the words finally began to make sense. She traveled with Zachary, taking short trips to visit Thomas in Seattle and see the sights of the Pacific Northwest that had been too far away when they were younger and busier. But mostly, she simply enjoyed the quiet rhythms of life with the man she loved. They would sit together on their porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the blue mountains, and talk about everything and nothing. They babysat their grandchildren and watched them grow into remarkable individuals in their own right. They attended weddings and funerals, celebrated victories and mourned losses, and through it all they remained each other's touchstone, the constant in a world that never stopped changing. When Violet turned 70, Samuel organized a huge celebration, bringing together the entire extended family for a weekend of festivities. There were children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, the product of Sarah's early marriage, and the house overflowed with noise and laughter and the beautiful chaos of a family that loved each other deeply. Violet moved through the celebration in a kind of daze, overwhelmed by the sheer number of lives she had touched, the ripples extending outward from the choices she had made so long ago in a makeshift hospital, when a wounded soldier had looked at her with understanding eyes and seen something she had not known was there. Late in the evening, when the younger children had been put to bed, and the adults were sitting around talking in quiet voices, Zachary found her standing alone in the garden they had planted together 50 years earlier. He came and stood beside her, his presence as familiar as her own heartbeat, and together they looked up at the stars blazing overhead in the clear night sky. "You know what I am most grateful for?" Zachary asked after a long silence. "What?" Violet replied, leaning against him. "That I got shot," he said, and when she looked at him in surprise, he was smiling. "That wound brought me to you, and you brought me to life. Everything good in my world flows from that moment. So yes, I am grateful for the bullet that tore through my ribs and the wagon that brought me to Walla Walla, and the grace that put me in the care of the most remarkable woman I have ever known." Violet felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they were good tears, the kind that came from a heart so full it could not contain all the emotion. "I love you," she said simply. "After all these years, through everything we have been through, I love you more now than I did on the day we married." "And I love you," Zachary replied, pulling her close. "My compassionate healer, my partner, my best friend. You are my home, Violet, and you always will be." They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms while the sounds of their family drifted out from the house, and the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. And Violet thought about the girl she had been, the one who had believed that duty and sacrifice were the only paths to meaning, and she wished she could go back and tell her younger self that there was another way. That love did not diminish you, but expanded you, that allowing yourself to be cared for was not weakness but the greatest strength. That sometimes the most important healing happened not in the dramatic saves, but in the quiet moments of connection between two people who chose to face the world together. The years that followed were gentler, slower, marked more by continuity than change. Violet and Zachary settled into the comfortable patterns of old age, their days defined by simple pleasures and the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. They watched their grandchildren graduate and marry and begin families of their own, the cycle continuing into another generation. Thomas completed his medical training and returned to Walla Walla to join the hospital staff, and Violet took immense pride in seeing him treat patients with the same combination of skill and compassion that had defined her own practice. Rebecca published a book about teaching methods that gained her some recognition beyond Walla Walla, and Samuel took over ownership of the ranch where Zachary had worked for so many years, transforming it into one of the most successful operations in the valley. Their children had taken the foundation Violet, and Zachary had built and expanded upon it, creating their own legacies while honoring the values they had learned from their parents. When Zachary's health began to fail in his late 70s, declining gradually rather than all at once, Violet became his caregiver with the same dedication she had once brought to tending wounded soldiers. She administered his medications and monitored his symptoms, and sat with him through the difficult nights when pain made sleep impossible. It was hard, watching the strong, capable man she had loved for more than half a century become frail and vulnerable. but she never begrudged him a moment of her care. This was love too, she understood, not just the passionate romance of their early years, but the steady commitment to be there through the end, however it might come. He died peacefully one spring morning, with Violet holding his hand and their children gathered around his bed. His last words were for her, a whispered thank you that carried the weight of a lifetime of gratitude. And then he was gone, slipping away so gently that for a moment she thought he had simply fallen asleep. The grief was enormous, a crushing weight that made it hard to breathe. They had been together for 55 years, more than 3/4 of her life, and his absence left a hole that nothing could fill. But even in the depths of her mourning, Violet felt gratitude for the years they had shared, for the love that had sustained them both through so many trials, for the family they had created together. She continued living in the house they had built, surrounded by memories and watched over by her children who visited frequently to check on her. Thomas had his own family now, a wife and 2 young daughters who called Violet Grammy and brought light into her darkest days. Rebecca's children were grown, pursuing their own dreams in various corners of the country, but they wrote regularly and visited when they could. And Samuel's grandchildren, Violet's great-great-grandchildren, represented a future she would not live to see but could imagine with hope and wonder. On what would have been her and Zachary's 60th anniversary, Violet returned to the high meadow where he had first told her he loved her, and where they had celebrated a decade of marriage. She was 83 now, her body frail but her mind still sharp, and the climb up the hill left her breathless and aching. But when she stood at the edge looking out over the valley, the effort was worth it. So much had changed since that first time. The valley was fully settled now, farmland stretching as far as she could see, and Walla Walla had grown into a proper town with paved streets and automobiles, and all the trappings of modern life. The wild frontier of her youth was gone, transformed into something tamer and more civilized but no less beautiful in its own way. She thought about the young woman she had been, standing in a makeshift hospital and believing she had to carry the weight of the world alone. She thought about the wounded soldier who had seen past her careful defenses to the person underneath and had loved what he found there. She thought about the life they had built together, the children they had raised, the love that had sustained them through war and peace, through joy and sorrow, through all the ordinary miracles and mundane difficulties that comprised a life. "Your compassion heals more than just bodies," she whispered to the wind, remembering those words that had changed everything. "And your love healed me, Zachary. It made me whole in ways I had not known I was broken. Thank you for seeing me, for choosing me, for building this beautiful life with me." She stood there for a long time as the sun began to set, painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson. And though Zachary was gone, she felt his presence beside her, felt the love that had connected them still vibrant and alive, transcending death itself. They had been lucky, she and her cowboy, to find each other in the chaos of a frontier town during a time of conflict and suffering. They had built something lasting, something that would ripple forward through generations in the form of their children and grandchildren, and all those who came after. As full darkness fell and the stars began to emerge, Violet turned and made her careful way back down the hill toward home. Her body was tired, ready for the rest that would eventually come, but her heart was full. She had lived a good life, a meaningful life, filled with love and purpose, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had made a difference in the world. And when her time came to join Zachary, she would go peacefully, secure in the knowledge that their love story had been one worth telling, one worth living, one that would endure long after both of them were dust. She lived 3 more years after that visit to the meadow. Years spent surrounded by family and friends, watching new babies being born and celebrating the achievements of younger generations. She wrote her memoirs with Rebecca's help, preserving the stories of her early years nursing soldiers and the love that had blossomed in the midst of suffering. The book was published locally and became a cherished record of frontier life, a reminder of the sacrifices and triumphs of the people who had built communities in the wilderness. On the morning of her death, at 86 years old, Violet woke in the house she had shared with Zachary and felt a clarity that had been missing for some time. She called her children to her bedside, all three of them dropping everything to come when they heard the tone in her voice. She held their hands and told them how proud she was of the people they had become, how much joy they had brought into her life, how grateful she was to have been their mother. "Your father and I," she said, her voice growing fainter, "we built something good together. Something that will last long after we are gone because it lives in all of you and in your children and in everyone who carries our love forward. That is the real legacy, not the work we did or the things we accomplished, but the love we shared and the family we created. Remember that, and remember that you are loved beyond measure." She closed her eyes then, and with her children surrounding her and a smile on her lips, Violet Finch slipped peacefully away to join the cowboy who had seen her compassion and recognized it for the transformative force it was. Her last thought was of Zachary waiting for her in that high meadow where they had shared so many important moments, and the feeling that filled her was not fear but anticipation, not grief but joy. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, 3 generations of family and countless others, whose lives she had touched over her long years of service to the community. They told stories of her kindness and skill, her dedication and compassion, the way she had helped so many through their darkest hours. But the stories that meant the most were the ones told by her children, speaking of a mother who had shown them what it meant to love fully and live authentically, who had demonstrated through her own example that the greatest strength came from vulnerability and connection. She was buried next to Zachary in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking Walla Walla, and the marker they placed bore both their names and a simple inscription: "Together in life, together in love, together forever." And though their bodies rested in the earth, their story lived on, passed down through the generations as an example of what love could accomplish when 2 people chose to face the world together, when compassion and courage combined to create something greater than either could achieve alone. The house that Violet and Zachary had built together remained in the family, passing first to Samuel and then to his children, always maintained as a gathering place where the family could come together and remember their roots. The garden they had planted continued to bloom each spring, tended by loving hands that honored the legacy of those who had first broken ground there so many years before. And on quiet evenings when the light was just right, those who knew the story would swear they could sometimes see 2 figures standing together at the edge of the property, looking out over the valley they had loved, their hands intertwined, and their hearts forever joined in the love that had sustained them through a lifetime of trials and triumphs. This was the story of Violet and Zachary, the nurse and the cowboy who had found each other in the midst of suffering and built a love that transcended time itself. It was a story of compassion and courage, of healing and hope, of 2 people who had recognized in each other something precious and had chosen to nurture it into something extraordinary. And though they were gone, their love remained, a beacon lighting the way for all who came after, proof that even in the hardest times and the most difficult circumstances, love could not only survive but flourish, growing deeper and stronger with each passing year until it became the foundation upon which entire worlds were built.